One of the things that China has been sort of offering the world in the past maybe decade or so is an alternative to the US hegemony in small ways, like in hopeful ways that we might be reaching some sort of multipolarity. And one of the initiatives has been the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, that's been accused, one of the propaganda points against China is that the Belt and Road Initiative is debt trade diplomacy. The irony of that is, of course, that the IMF and the World Bank, and you definitely know a lot about the IMF and the World Bank, have for decades been systemic tools for US economic hegemony, undermining sovereignty and economic stability around the world. Can you help us unpack the realities of these different initiatives and provide some real life examples of how the IMF and the World Bank consistently convince countries to adopt policies against their own interests?
Ileana, you've just asked me a huge
I
question,
know.
which covers so many different important issues. I think it's important to recognize that the system, which was created in 1944 at Bretton Woods, was a flawed system. Although I have a great deal of respect for Keynes, for example, the most influential economist of the 20th century, nonetheless, the system was flawed. Perhaps not entirely of his own doing, because it was the Americans who were calling the shots in 1944. But basically, the system in Bretton Woods did not ensure that there was nothing to deter countries from having a huge trade surplus. And that's precisely the source of the problems. Countries which were basically devastated after World War II, such as Germany and Japan, who were deterred from having military spending because they were seen as responsible for World War II, they were encouraged to catch up, to grow, to keep them in the camp of the so-called free world, the American-led free world, against the Soviet Union and its allies. So this was the world which was created. And so the development of the system was basically favorable to this so-called free world. But what also happened was that it privileged the Americans. And there was growing resentment, especially from Europe. And in the 1960s, for example, the French president, Charles de Gaulle, and his finance minister, who later became president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, they referred to the position of the US under the Bretton Woods system as giving them an exorbitant privilege. And what this basically meant was that the US could borrow indefinitely from the rest of the world without having to pay back, precisely because the rest of the world was running a trade surplus and the US was running a permanent trade deficit. Now, the permanent trade deficit did not come about immediately. It began to grow during the 1960s. But what happened was immediately after World War II, the only place where the industrial capacities had grown during World War II was the US. And because the US is on a continent which is so far away from Europe or Japan, remember that when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they never reached the continent, the North American continent. They only attacked the Hawaiian Islands. So the geography protected the US to a great extent. So the US came through the World War II unscathed. And because of full employment during World War II, when women, for example, were employed in higher numbers than ever before and ever since, we find that there was a certain kind of equality which came about during this period. But the point to be made here is that this was a time when the US was providing a huge surplus and on fairly generous terms to protect the future of American hegemony. So you find, for example, that the US was producing a great deal which it exported to the rest of the world on fairly generous terms, but not only to rebuild Europe under what was called the Marshall Plan, but also to Northeast Asia, for example, to Japan, because the Soviet troops were very close to Japan when the bomb was dropped. I mean, part of the reason for the Americans dropping the bomb was to seize the advantage from the Soviet Union, because it was the Soviets who defeated the Nazis in Europe. So this was an attempt to try to seize the advantage again. So they did that quite successfully. But by the 1960s, industrial capacities were beginning to be rebuilt, not only in Germany and Japan, but also in the rest of Europe, which had been bombed out. I mentioned earlier that my father had been to London right after the war for the Victory Parade, which had to be postponed because of the devastation left by Hitler and Werner von Braun's rockets during World War II. So all this basically meant that during the 1960s, when Kennedy became president, he was persuaded to slowly open up the US economy. The US economy was very protectionist up to then, but he began to open up quite a bit. And that opening up slowly opened up. And so the US economy began to export a great deal. And because of the role of the military during World War II, especially, and after World War II, many people might remember that there was a president during the 1950s by the name of Eisenhower, who had been a general during World War II. He was the leading general in Europe. So Eisenhower basically warned at the end of his presidency of the growing power of what was called the military-industrial complex. And this military-industrial complex has continued to become much more influential, contrary to what Eisenhower had warned. But the key point to remember is that this influence and power of the military-industrial complex basically meant two things. One, that they continued to grow in influence, not only in corporate terms, but also in terms of government policy. And a great deal of research was undertaken by the military-industrial complex. And because much of the research undertaken by the military-industrial complex were for dual purpose or multi-purpose ends, so we have had, for example, many benefits from that. For example, MRIs, which people have, or CAT scans, or the birth of the internet, and a whole range of things were actually from military-sponsored research. And some of the other research, for example, for diseases and so on, were done supported by the government. So rather than recognize how important government spending and government sponsorship of such research, what we find is that since Reagan, but especially with Trump, he does not appreciate this role of government. So they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. So the bathwater is the so-called deep state, the swamp, and all the other rhetoric which comes out of the Trump camp. And much of it, of course, has some basis. But precisely because of that, and giving the free hand to people like Mr. Musk and his minions, we have seen now the devastation and the hollowing out of government capacities in the US. So what has been the basis for American success and technological progress is now being undermined by the state itself. And this is going to be a huge problem. So what we find is that the role of the IMF was to maintain this system, which was created in 1944 and implemented a few years after the war. And basically, a crucial part of that system was supposed to be international trade. And there was a very important meeting held in Cuba, in Havana at that time, and they came up with the Havana Charter. But the proposal to liberalize trade in the 1940s was not acceptable to the US Congress. So the US Congress rejected it, but it was later in the early 1960s that under the Kennedy administration that this opening up of trade began. And it was very, very fast. And within a few years, American transnational companies became very dominant worldwide. And this, of course, opened up a new stage and gave rise to something which many people refer to as globalization. So the role of the IMF was basically as an enabler. But when it came to the rest of the world, especially developing countries, it has also been an economic policeman. And most importantly, it has controlled access to credit and especially emergency credit. So anytime countries get into trouble, often due to no fault of their own, once they get into trouble and they go to the IMF seeking emergency credit, the IMF does so, provides emergency credit, but always with conditionalities. Often the conditionalities have nothing to do with the source of the problem, the reason why the country had to go to the IMF, but rather it has to do with the dictates which of the most powerful countries in the world, both European as well as North American, who dominate the IMF. So the IMF is really the crucial institution. The World Bank was created also in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, and the World Bank is supposed to provide credit. The original name of the bank was for reconstruction and development. So the reconstruction of the countries of the North after World War II because of the devastation of World War II. So mainly Europe, but also other parts of the world which were devastated by World War II. So reconstruction refers to that. But that period is largely over. It's been over for quite some time. So the main role the World Bank plays is with regards to the rest of the world. But there are many problems with the World Bank, and it's very difficult to summarize all of them. But the World Bank was for many years the leading source of credit. Again, when providing credit, the World Bank would introduce what are called conditionalities. And especially following the collapse of the international monetary system from the early 1980s due to raising higher interest rates imposed by a man called Paul Volcker, who was chairman of the US Federal Reserve. Once that was done, many countries, especially Latin America, but also in Africa, had to go running to get emergency credit. At that time, the only source of so-called concessional emergency credit was the World Bank, but it came at a very heavy price. And the heavy price was in the form of what were called structural adjustment programs, where the World Bank imposed what was sometimes referred to as the Washington Consensus view of the reforms which should be taking place. So these were called structural adjustment programs, and these structural adjustment programs basically resulted in these countries all becoming much more open economies, but open in a double sense, open to trade on the one hand, but also open to foreign investment. So it basically provided a means for new forms of economic domination by most powerful countries in the world, most of which were in the north, what is now called the global north. They benefited a great deal for it, but it was all obscured by the more subtle relationships of exploitation, which were associated with these new types of relationships. And at an ideological level, this was facilitated by a number of things. So you had much more free trade, much more economic liberalization, much more privatization, the strengthening of property rights, and so on. And in this regard, Mrs. Thatcher, who had come to power from 1979, led the way. Although the UK was a shadow of its former imperial self, she had a very, very profound effect in terms of setting the agenda. Because the US had never had a significant large public sector. It had not had a strong militant trade union movement after the CIO amalgamated with the AFL, the American Federation of Labor in the United States. So the period of labor militancy was largely over in the US, and it never really had a large public sector, unlike the UK, where all this had been achieved, especially in the post-war period, not only during the period when labor was in power, but also very often when the Conservatives were in power. Macmillan, for example, did not try to undo, for example, the National Health Service and a number of other institutions. Council housing, for example, came in during this period. Much of the building of new housing after World War II was enabled by different levels of government in the UK. So the history of the US is quite different. This was made possible by a number of things, but very importantly, the use of war for acquiring political legitimacy also became very important. Mrs. Thatcher would not have been re-elected in 1983 if not for the fact that she had gone to war with Argentina in 1982. And that war gave her a certain credibility. She was doing very, very badly in the polls in 1982 before she went to war. And this happened again in 2003 when George W. Bush went to war with Iraq. Of course, they all knew that there weren't any weapons of mass destruction, but that provided a convenient excuse to go to war. And even though that war was largely won at a high cost of about 4 trillion, according to Joseph Stiglitz, and there's no real justification for that war. That war was a completely illegal war, but Nobody has ever been prosecuted. Nobody has been dragged before the International Criminal Court for that war. I mean, that war killed many more people, or for that matter, the Vietnam War, than many of these other things, which of the relatively small wars where people are being dragged to the International Criminal Court and so on. Not that these people do not deserve to be convicted and so on, but what I'm trying to point to is that the increasing politicization and weaponization of the rule of law, of multilateral institutions and so on, for the purposes of control, for the purposes of empire.